Imagine you're losing your hair, you want to do something about it, so you go to your doctor, but instead of him recommending standard treatments, he invites you to a clinical trial on a brand new hair growth compound. You're interested, you fill in the paperwork, then they hand you a mystery gel. You apply it once a day for 4 weeks. That's it. And then 4 weeks after that, you go and see that doctor, and lo and behold, you are rapidly regrowing hair. And it's not just happening in areas where you were thinning, it's happening in places where you were slick bald. This is not some fantasy. This is the story told by a press release from Pelage Pharmaceuticals. It's their top-line results on a phase 2 clinical trial for a compound called PP405. And unlike finasteride, this compound doesn't impact your hormones. Instead, it works by targeting stem cells to address unaccounted failures in your hair cycle. So balding hairs can reawaken fast and start producing thicker, better hair strands. This premise and this press release was what recently landed Pelage Pharmaceuticals a $120 million funding round for their phase 3 clinical trials on this very compound. And if PP405 proves effective and safe, it will be the biggest breakthrough in hair regeneration ever. Bigger than finasteride, bigger than minoxidil, bigger than hair transplants. And as the press release states, this could reshape how we think about clinical progress in hair growth. I hope that's true. That would be amazing. Let me tell you why I think it's not. Let me start off by saying that I always love celebrating innovation in the hair loss space. For those new here, my name is Rob English. I am a researcher who focuses on hair loss disorders. I'm on the editorial board of a dermatology journal. I publish papers related to hair loss. I act as a peer reviewer for manuscripts about hair loss disorders. I do consumer advocacy research at Perfect Hair Health. I follow hair loss news closely. And so I have a decent understanding of what's in the pipeline for future treatments. And let me say that PP405 is a pretty cool one, and for a variety of reasons. First, this is a novel compound that takes an entirely new approach to hair regeneration in androgenic alopecia. Now that's a chronic and progressive hair loss disorder that worsens over time and through something called hair follicle miniaturization. So the strands of hair, they get thinner and thinner and thinner over a series of years to decades. And to our current understanding, that process is predominantly driven by interactions between our genetics and male hormones, specifically dihydrotestosterone or DHT. And so the best long-term treatments for androgenic alopecia, they typically center around therapeutically lowering that one hormone, and often with drugs like finasteride or dutasteride. Yet while these compounds can stop hair loss in most men and regrow some hair back, they're also imperfect. They typically can only rewind the clock on how your hair used to look by around 6 months to 36 months. So hair loss 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or longer, that often stays gone. And they also take a long time to work. Cosmetic results can typically take at least 6 months to start showing, and then 24 months or longer before their full effects are achieved. And lastly, medications of any type, but especially finasteride and dutasteride, these can cause side effects in a small but significant portion of people. So the issues with side effects, the timing of results, the magnitude of hair recovery, they leave much to be desired in the hair loss industry, especially for people who are starting their hair growth journey maybe later than its early to mid stages. Now, PP405 aims to fix all of this. According to data released by Pelage Pharmaceuticals, this compound is housed in a gel that you apply to your scalp once daily, with early pharmacokinetic data suggesting that it doesn't go systemic. It stays on your scalp. And even better, it doesn't mess with your male hormones. It works by targeting hair follicle stem cells. Now these stem cells, they're preserved in balding scalps, but they seem to lack the ability to differentiate into other cell types needed to regrow hair. It's this combination of localization, but also this different mechanism that they're attacking that make PP405 really exciting for people who can't use or won't use finasteride or dutasteride. It might prove to be better and safer. And allegedly, it also works quickly. According to Pelage Pharmaceuticals' press release, it didn't take 6 to 12 months for their study participants in this phase 2 clinical study to see hair regrowth. It happened in mere weeks. And lastly, it seems to be regrowing hair allegedly on slick bald areas. The press release states that new hairs were seen coming from follicles that had previously shown no hairs growing from them at all. All in, when you read this press release, it feels like we are on the precipice of a safer, better, faster working hair loss treatment. And so it's no wonder why VCs and Google are throwing money into this phase 3 clinical trial and this company. I am hopeful too, but is it time to get excited? First, let's pause. because we need to do our own differentiation, not the stem cell differentiation, but the kind where we actually differentiate what the internet is saying about this press release versus what the PP405 press release actually says versus what the press release doesn't say. I am not trying to be a buzzkill. I want this treatment to work, but these are important details. And as we walk through this together with a fine-tooth comb, I think you're going to be shocked at what was left in, but also what was left out. To start, the internet is saying that of the men and women who tried PP405, 31% achieved at least 20% more hair growth after just 8 weeks of daily application. That would be insane if it were true. It's actually not correct. If we look at Pelage's press release, not what other people are writing about it, we'll see that there's been a misstatement on the internet. Pelage's press release says that in men with a higher degree of hair loss, 31% of those people treated with PP405 exhibited a greater than 20% increase in hair density. So it's not 31% of all their trial participants, it's just 31% of a subgroup. So how big is this subgroup really? Well, let's do an exercise to estimate. First, we can look at Pelage's clinical trial filing. We know they ran a study on 78 men and women total with pattern hair loss or androgenic alopecia. And we know that this trial included both people applying PP405 and also people applying a placebo. So some people got the treatment, other people got a fake treatment. For purposes of this exercise, let's just say that 2/3 of the people got the treatment and 2/3 got the placebo. So now we have 52 people trying PP405 and then 26 people trying the placebo. We also know the trial included men and women, but in the quote, they don't mention women. They specifically only say men. So in this study, if we assume a 50-50 split for men and women, we have to cut that number in half. So now we have 26 men trying PP405 and 13 trying a placebo. These numbers are getting smaller, and just wait because we're not even close to done yet. Next, the stat didn't specify all men. It said men with higher degrees of hair loss. So let's look at the study inclusion criteria for participants and see who that might be. We can see Pelage included men with hair loss severities of Norwood 3, 4, and 5. And for purposes of this exercise, let's assume there's roughly an equal number of Norwood levels across all of these remaining participants. So for the men in the PP405 group, maybe 10 are a Norwood 3, maybe 8 are a Norwood 4, and maybe 8 are a Norwood 5. And in the placebo, maybe that spread is 5, 4, and 4. Now, when Pelage says men with higher degrees of hair loss, that's kind of subjective. It can't be all these men, otherwise they would have just said all men in the study. So I'm guessing men with higher degrees of hair loss means either just the Norwood 5s or maybe the Norwood 4s and the Norwood 5s combined. Let's be extra charitable and say it's the Norwood 4s and the Norwood 5s combined so we can keep these subgroups as big as possible. That leaves us with 16 men with advanced hair loss trying PP405 and 8 with advanced hair loss in the placebo group. Pelage's specific stat is that of these men, 31% saw hair density improvements greater than 20% compared to 0% in the placebo group. So how many men is that? That's 31% of 16. And that number is 5 men. That's it. That's what this statistic is saying. It's not saying 31% of all participants saw 20% or more hair regrowth, both male and female. It's saying that of men receiving the treatment with advanced hair loss, only 31% saw a 20% increase in hair density or better. All of a sudden, when we break this stat down, it starts to feel a little bit less meaningful and possibly a little bit more like statistics hunting. And yet, a 20% increase in hair density, that is a lot, right? That's what the internet is emphasizing, because keep in mind the gold standard drug, finasteride, boosts hair counts by just 10% and maybe hair density by 20 to 30%. But that happens over 1 to 2 years. Pelage is getting this outcome in just 8 weeks. So that's amazing, correct? Well, it would be amazing so long as we know exactly how those hair density changes were calculated. But we don't. When I read Pelage's press release, they don't specify how they counted the hairs. And when I went into their clinical trial registration, I was shocked to see that they don't even list hair parameters as a primary or secondary endpoints. Very unusual. In other words, not only did they not tell anyone in their clinical trial registration that they were planning on tracking hair measurements as an endpoint, again, that's odd, but in their press release, they don't tell you how they track these endpoints either. So why does this matter? Well, because here's a study on CBD oil that showed a 246% increase in hair count. And here's a study on copper peptides that showed an 80% increase in hair count. And no one takes these studies seriously, and virtually no users of CBD oil or copper peptides see appreciable cosmetic hair regrowth because the researchers in those studies got crafty with the way they counted hairs, which likely exaggerated the true benefits of the topicals. In the case of the copper peptide study, the researchers very likely included both vellus hairs and terminal hairs in their total hair assessments. So vellus hairs are thin, wispy, they're often unpigmented, they barely grow long at all. Look closely at the scalp where you've lost hair. You'll see thousands of vellus hairs. And you can grow 10,000 more and they'd never change how your hair looked visually. And because vellus hairs, they're so easily stimulated by almost anything, serious hair loss research teams will deliberately exclude them from their hair count assessments. They'll create a cutoff, usually a hair thickness of around or under 40 micrometers, and any hairs that are that thick or below, they'll just toss out of the analysis. That's what the finasteride studies did. It's why they only showed an increase in non-vellus hair counts and a 70 to 80% satisfaction score from patients. And yet if you don't do that, you'll run a study on copper peptides showing an 80% increase in hair counts, but of course a 14% in patient satisfaction. There's a huge disparity there, and something like that strongly suggests that the hair counting methods in that study were not done well. And with the CBD study, the reason those hair count increases are so amazing is simply because the researchers measured starting hair counts where the participants virtually had no hair to begin with, nearly slick bald regions. So if you have 5 hairs in a 1 square centimeter area and you gain 2 hairs, that's a 40% increase in hair density due to the law of small numbers. But if you'd picked a more reasonable spot, say where you had 100 hairs per square centimeter, then that 2 hair increase would have only been 2% because you go from 100 to 102. And in either case, it wouldn't have mattered because in both cases, an absolute hair increase of 2 hairs is really not cosmetically meaningful. So when we reflect back on the Pelage press release, they really emphasized results on a subgroup of men, those with advanced hair loss. In other words, probably those Norwood 5s, where you also happen to have very little starting hair to begin with. So that greater than 20% increase in hair density, is it really that meaningful? Or is it really something like they started with 5 hairs and they ended with 7, which is a 40% increase to hair counts? Because I have to be frank, when I see such selective reporting in a press release about one subgroup, and in that report, the company only states the percentage increase in hair counts, but also deliberately excludes telling us about the absolute hair count changes, and it happens to be on the subgroup that is most susceptible to big percentage swings due to the law of small numbers. Again, people who have very low hair density to begin with. If you have 1 hair and I grow 1 more hair for you, you just increased your hair density by 100%. I start to look at this and I start to wonder if this is a truly meaningful impact that they're getting from this treatment. If you want to learn more, watch our videos on cheating hair counts, watch our evidence quality masterclass, watch our recent video on clascoterone's 539% increase in hair counts. You'll be shocked at how creative companies get when trying to garner excitement around whatever they'd like to sell you. So we've addressed this statistic. We've flagged concerns about that greater than 20% hair density change. But what about the other parts of Pelage's press release that everybody's talking about? The part that said by week 8, PP405 demonstrated an ability to induce new hair growth from follicles where no hair was previously present. In fact, Pelage went on to suggest in that press release that typically visible hair regrowth requires 6 to 12 months of continuous therapy, suggesting PP405 may yield a more rapid clinical response than current treatments. Again, this sounds awesome. They're alleging the potential for not only a bigger response, but also a faster one. Because according to clinical data, for cosmetic regrowth to present for currently available treatments like minoxidil, that takes 3 to 6 months on average. Or for finasteride, it takes 6 months to begin to see cosmetic results and then up to 2 years for those results to peak. And yet Pelage is saying PP405 might produce a clinical result in just 8 weeks. But what does that mean? What does clinical response mean? Are they actually talking about visual hair growth you can see from afar? Without more information, I would have my doubts. Hair grows around 1/2 inch per month, and when new hair cycles are starting from regrowth, they start off very faintly. They're very difficult to see in the first 8 weeks of treatment, especially unless you're using a microzoom device. So I'm apt to believe that Pelage might just be reinforcing their other findings here, that some users saw rapid improvements to hair density in some sort of trichoscopy in just 8 weeks. And maybe suggesting that this is new hair growth, yes, even if microscopic, and that's impressive because of just how quickly it's happening and the fact that it's happening in areas previously no longer having had hair follicles that were producing hairs. And again, that would be an amazing finding. And yet, I'm not totally sold that that's actually what they're trying to say. Because for decades, we also already know that currently approved hair loss treatments regrow hair rapidly at a microscopic level. Here is a study showing that minoxidil increases hair counts within the first 6 weeks. Here's another study replicating those results. And guess what? It showed a 30% increase to hair counts by week 8. Here's another study replicating those results, again, also at week 8. And here's a study on finasteride showing a similar effect. This study had a 6-week washout period from weeks 0 to 6, and then people initiated finasteride therapy at week 6. And so there's a 6-week measurement point between week 6 and week 12. And you can see already that the hair weights from treatment are starting to increase. So researchers have long observed rapid microscopic hair count improvements within 6 to 8 weeks when starting minoxidil or finasteride. And it's because these treatments can rapidly synchronize hair cycles, they can increase the speed in which hairs re-enter their growth or anagen phases. They can also encourage the recovery of what are called kenogen hairs. This is why that growth can happen microscopically so quickly before it starts to grow out cosmetically. If you want to learn more about this, watch our video on whether it's too late to reverse hair loss. Also watch our video on why I think full hair recoveries will one day become possible. But the broader point here is that it's not uncommon. In fact, it's expected for current hair loss treatments to produce hair count changes and hair density changes at both the speed and the magnitude reported by investigators of PP405. So I'm a bit stumped here as to why they're talking about this. Are we talking about true cosmetic hair regrowth in an 8-week time frame? That would outpace how fast hairs can actually grow and then present cosmetically. But if they had progress photos to corroborate the claim, then I'd be totally open to revising my opinion in light of that new information. And of course, the press release doesn't include before and after photos. And statements with phrasing like clinical response, I generally want to see it to believe it. I don't want to take the press release's word for it in this case. It's almost too big of a claim. So all in, where do we stand? Well, I find myself excited by PP405's novel approach to hair growth. I really hope it works. It'd be amazing to have something that works better, faster, and more safely than the currently available treatments. But I am also very skeptical of the press release covering their phase 2 clinical study results. From my vantage point, Pelage emphasizes percent increases to hair density, but excludes what really matters to contextualize those results, the absolute hair count changes. Pelage reports hair metrics, but they omit how their hair metrics were actually measured, not only in their press release, but also during the registry of their clinical trial, the latter of which I find kind of strange. The only reason I can think of somebody doing this is because they'd want the ability to collect that data, but the flexibility to choose whether or not to report it in their registration results. So if their metrics maybe come back bad, they wouldn't need to submit those results as part of their tabulations in the clinical trial registry. Pelage emphasizes big hair density increases, but only on subgroups who happen to be the most prone to statistical manipulation, the ones who are already the most bald, and who will thereby have the least hair in their starting hair counts. So they'll have the biggest to gain from a percentage. Again, if you start with 1 hair and I give you 1 more, I just increased your hair density by 100%. Sounds impressive? It's meaningless. And lastly, Pelage seems to intimate an unprecedented speed of response from their treatment. And yet decades of clinical studies show hair metric responses of both the same speed and the same magnitude from finasteride and minoxidil. All this leaves me quite reserved in just how hopeful I am for PP405 in its phase 3 clinical studies. There are just too many unknowns, no validation through peer review, or even the availability of raw data for me to feel any differently at this stage. But with time and with more data, my hope is that this changes. And for what it's worth, I did reach out to Pelage through email. I congratulated them on their results. I also asked them for clarity on their hair counting methods, their inclusion or exclusion of vellus hairs. I asked them about their definition of vellus hairs, how they defined clinical response, how they're distinguishing the rapidity of their treatment's responses as unique versus the data we already have on finasteride and minoxidil, and a few other things that would have cleared up all of my reservations. I did receive an auto reply encouraging me to sign up for the PP405 mailing list, but as of the publication of this video, I haven't yet received a reply answering my questions. Now, I don't blame Pelage for not getting back to me, and I also don't see this as conspiratorial. It's not like they're trying not to get back to me. I'm betting they get hundreds of emails every day, and the odds of my email first getting read and then making its way to the eyes of a principal investigator and then them taking the time out of their day to answer these questions, the odds of that are extremely low. So I'm not alleging they're ignoring my email intentionally. That would be absolutely ridiculous. The odds are higher that they happen to not see it or it's not in the right hands. Personally, I get 150 emails a day and I miss important ones every single day by accident. And I could spend all day glued to my email and do nothing else and I'd still never adequately reply to everybody. But I did want to mention this for the completeness of this video because I'm always open to having these conversations. And there is good news. This year, Pelage has stated that they plan to release their data on PP405 at an upcoming conference. And when that conference comes, and when we see that data, I'm looking forward to digging in and seeing what it says. And while I still have my skepticism, I hope the outcomes are absolutely incredible. I mean, who would not want better, safer, faster working hair loss treatments? But the onus remains on Pelage to produce data that actually confirms this, rather than the press release that reads more like a fantasy novel. In the meantime, we need to make do with the treatments we currently have, because when fighting hair loss, time is of the essence. There are a lot of treatment options out there with combination therapies that are sometimes capable of not only stabilizing hair growth for the average person, but also getting 10, 20, sometimes 30% or more hair gains from when you started. And if you're in the US, we founded our telehealth brand Ulo to offer these best-in-class hair loss treatments to everyone who is ready to take action. We offer a level of personalization that is unrivaled by other brands, including topicals and orals if prescribed. You can check us out in the links below, but also feel free to shop around. Fundamentally, it doesn't matter to me where you get started, so long as you have enough of an educational foundation to just choose a path, set realistic expectations, know how long it's going to take to finally start seeing results, troubleshoot your side effects, and succeed in the long run, whichever direction that is. That's all. I wish you the best with your hair recovery. I will see you in the next video.